a pattern which seems to tell us that human beings get into major trouble as groups about every 6 centuries. They get into a situation from which it does not seem that they can easily extricate themselves. Or they reach a critical point in which, did they continue, would lead to the premature disintegration of their civilization. It is quite possible that had not Pythagoras become the great spokesman of Greek learning, that the golden age of Pericles could not have followed. For we do realize that it was the tremendous shift to a philosophical basis which he instituted that became the impetus, or bestowed the impetus, upon the great rise of philosophy in the Greek states, resulting in about 600 years of philosophy in Greece. Philosophy which definitely continued until the final disintegration of the original academy and the falling apart of Greek national existence under the inroads of the Roman Empire. Now, it's interesting also to note that the last Greek philosopher is said to have died 600 AD, which would be again one of these climactic periods. Therefore, that it took considerable time for the final disintegration of the direct impetus of these schools. The contribution made by Buddha, beginning in the 6th century and extending through the long years of his own life, continued down with comparatively slight change till about the beginning of the Christian era. 600 years after Buddha rose the great reformations which have been attributed to Sankaracharya. And these reformations resulted in the complete shift of Buddhism and the rise of the Mahayana, or great vehicle. And the principal leaders of that great vehicle movements were contemporaries of Jesus and lived 600 years after Pythagoras. Thus, the peculiar involvement of these dates becomes important. Another important point that I think we should realize, and which perhaps has lost a little of its validity in our modern thinking, is that in antiquity, the great changes that were to be noted in the descent of man are always upon the levels of religion and philosophy. Nations rise and fall, states come and go, kings overthrew each other, but the major motions in those periods were not the result of war or the result of the corruption of dynasty, except indirectly. The great changes were due to the rise of individuals who made positive claim to revelational insight, or who claimed a ministry, or claimed a right to contribute to the spiritual enlightenment of their fellow men. Thus, at the time we mention, and also at the time of the beginning of the Christian era, the principal motions originated in man's religious convictions. These were the motions which made way for education to rise. I think we should therefore say that 600 years BC approximately dates the beginning of man's formal concept of education. It is assumed generally, historically, that the Academy of Pythagoras at Crotona was the first formal educational institution in the Mediterranean area. There is much to indicate that the school of Confucius was the first broad, comprehensive curriculum of education introduced in China. And we know definitely that it was from Buddhism and its emancipating influence upon the public mind that the great university systems of India received their greatest impulse, and the most famous institution of learning in the ancient world, the University of Nalanda, came into being. Thus, the 600 BC date has in most instances been directly associated with religion as educational liberation. Our friends of that period, with the possible exception of Lao Tzu, were not essentially mystics. They were essentially teachers, and even Lao Tzu was a librarian of the libraries of the Chu, the highest intellectual position in China. These men were essentially teachers, not preachers. They came with spiritual authority, but their idea of religion was comprehensive. In this era, there was no division between man's religious insight, his arts and his sciences and his crafts. In these days, the total enlightenment of man was in the keeping of the ancient teachers. And the spiritual leader was also the grammarian, the mathematician, the astronomer, and in many cases, in fact usually, the physician. The records, for instance, left by Pythagoras give us some realization of the broad scope of the man's achievement. He is remembered, of course, for his magnificent contribution to mathematics, particularly the great 47th proposition or Pythagorean proposition in geometry. He is remembered for his researches in astronomy and cosmogony. He is accredited with the discovery of the diatonic scale in music. He is recognized as one of the earliest exponents of the formal type of poetry, particularly the use of the hexameter meter. He is known as a physician and an expert on color, number, and many other subjects. He was a man of universal learning. For in these days, leadership in philosophy implied achievement in astronomy, mathematics, and music. And Pythagoras was a musician. Confucius was a musician. And these men, in no sense of the word, could be regarded as limited to what we might term a theological religious perspective. They had no such restriction upon themselves. All learning was their scope. In a large measure, the same thing is true of Buddha. And we find frequent references in the ancient Buddhistic writings to his attainments in other subjects than that which we regard as associated with him, philosophy and religion. We know that the last of the Zoroastrians was regarded as a man of exceptional attainments in medicine and in many other fields of learning. Thus we have a synthetic approach rather than an analytical one. And we find the outpouring of streams of intellectual energy aimed at preserving and sustaining the security of peoples. We have these men, and at the same period the rise of the great lawgivers of Greece, Solon, Pittacus, Periander, Cleobulus, the men who gave to Greece its great codes of law. We also have rising in China great systems of legislative code, and in this period also the rise of Chinese and Indian astronomy. They were rich periods of outpouring, and these outpourings became the strength of the various cultural groups. India remained essentially sound in its Buddhistic teaching for approximately 600 years. China enjoyed the great mystical revelation of Lao Tzu until about the beginning of the Christian era, when mysticism in this field began to move into other manifestations. Taoism is divided into 3 distinct periods, these periods corresponding again in timing with the Phoenix cycle. From these various considerations we come to a major one, therefore, namely that for some reason nearly every work of man must be subjected to powerful revitalization periodically.